Right, the latch for the rewind button. I want to get that into position, and I'll use molybdenum paste on here. On that round tip at the front, it's under quite a bit of friction there. That sits in there. The return spring. The return spring is hiding. What a surprise. We have a return spring. Pop that into there. The shoulder screw goes through there. The spring must be free to revolve around the shoulder of the screw. The lever itself must be free to revolve around the other shoulder on the screw. Now if I can lift that spring tab up and over. Right, that's all under tension and ready to go. We need our sprocket shaft, And our sprocket shaft, I'm going to lubricate this with a bit of synthetic grease towards the top. You can see where it passes through the casting. There'll be bright spots, that bright area there where it's been rubbing. And I'm going to put a little bit on the pinion at the top. Big as this camera. Nothing is quite as shiny as it should be. The sprocket goes in the slot side towards the top of the camera. The shaft goes right through to the base. I'm supporting that with my finger from underneath. If I pull this back, the shaft will come right through. And this is driven with a small screw. It goes in here and couples the shaft together with the sprocket. It's much like the screws for holding the hinge pins in place for the front door, except in this case it's a longer screw. So if you look at the three screws, you'll be able to figure out which is the odd man out, and it belongs here. The rewind button on the base of the camera. There's our button. There's its washer. Its spring. Is here. I'll lubricate the spring with some synthetic grease. Put the spring on the button. Put the washer over the button. Hold my finger on the top to keep that shaft pressed down, and this screws onto the base of the sprocket shaft. Checking that it will depress, it's not caught on anything. And I'll use my special pliers to tighten that up. These are just some pliers I've modified to do that job. And that is the rewind button in position. That latches in place, and as soon as the film advance comes round, it releases it, lets it drop back out of the way. Right, I want to get this base of this camera closed up as quickly as I can before I do any more damage to that leatherette. So the tripod socket is held in place with 3 screws. get all 3 screws in position before you tighten anything up. Alright, 3 screws are in place. Tighten those, they're good to go. Now the shield that goes around the rewind button can go on. That's held in with 2 small brass flathead screws. Nip those 2 up. Now I can glue that leatherette down before I do any damage to anything. This leatherette's a bit vulnerable, so I'm going to put my adhesive on a piece of paper and then transfer it over with a toothpick. And you apply the adhesive always to the leatherette, not to the camera body. If you apply it to the camera body, it'll do useful things like run down holes in the casting and stick some piece of the mechanism that should be able to move freely. Just make sure I wipe off all the excess, especially around that hole where it goes around that rewind button. That's better. Press that down into position and press the leatherette firmly down into place. Now you'll see quite clearly that there's a line across here. That's as far back as I'd peeled those leatherettes. If it had been leather in particular, I would have peeled it all the way back to this end. We still would have had the line, but it would have been at this point, you'd never notice it. Whenever you peel it back and you glue it back down, you're left with a line. Now that's part of the answer here. The other part is that there's cracks in the leatherette at that point, and that's because it didn't enjoy folding back. This leatherette is quite brittle. It'll certainly crack and become damaged. Now I'm cheating with this camera because normally I would fit the front door before I put all this in place, but I've got a way of getting around that and I'm going to use it. I'm more worried about this leatherette because it was ugly when we started with it, and it hasn't got any prettier. Well, that's good. That part looks very good. And that surround that goes on there could go in place now. Now I've got 2 screws there prepared for this job. Now I know that you can use one of them, will work nicely full length. I can't remember which one it is. The other one certainly needs to be cut down short. That'll screw on all the way. Nothing's catching there. It doesn't foul the rewind button. So it must be this one here that needs to be short. I think it just runs into the body casting from memory. Let's find out. Yeah, it only goes down that far, so I need to shorten that screw up. Right, well I'll do that. I'll just go away and just take the end off that with the Dremel, I think would be the answer, and put that in place. Well, it looks much happier with both screws in place. I can turn my attention to putting the focus mount in now, I think, and getting all that under control. And I'll deal with the rest of the film advance after that. Here's the focus mount. As you can see, I've glued back all the felt that had come off the back of it. Got that all sorted out and put back. This just goes up onto the behind the front standard, and it's held in place with 4 screws. And the 4 screws are somewhat shorter than the screws that held the tripod socket in at the base of the camera. Right, they're all in place. I'll tighten those 4 screws up. Now you can see I'm supporting the front standard between finger and thumb here, so I'm not pressing down on it and putting any stress on the struts. Right, so that's in place. I can collapse that down. We've got our 4 black screws that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. We'll get those in position. This one's just dropped in. Have to retrieve that in a second. Let's get these 2 started. Retrieve the one that fell down into the body. Put that in there. And the 4th one in this corner. In doing these 4 screws up, you've got to be fairly cautious because you are not pulling metal up to metal. They don't tighten up to a quick finish. They just get progressively harder to tighten up as you are compressing the leather and the felt. So you just need to exercise a bit of caution. Don't just keep winding until they come to a hard stop. They're never going to get there. All you'll end up doing is snapping something. Right, that's all good. My focus helical. Well, here's the inner and outer. I've had these apart, they've been cleaned, everything runs exceptionally smoothly. Here are my alignment marks. I put 2 alignment marks there at the base, and there was one opposite them at the top here. And that's just to allow me so I know that I've got it in the right position, because the front surfaces are level with each other and those marks line up. And I know that the 2 lines went at the base of the camera, the single line went at the top. So I'm not putting any grease on this yet. I'm just going to drop it into the casting and see if it moves smoothly. And that's moving very nicely indeed. So I know that that's all good. There's no problem there. I can lubricate this with a bit of helical grease and then put the retaining ring in place. You don't need to smother this in helical grease. I normally back out my threads almost all the way and then wipe grease on like that in about 5 or 6 patches around the thread. Just work that in, make sure that moves very smoothly. Want some around the back faces there, where this outer helical sits down into the focus mount. And the 2 slots, opposite little holes, in those 2 slots, that's where it runs on the guide rails here in the mount. Now I know which way up because I've got my 2 marks at the bottom, so I can put that in there. drop that into position. Got that to one side. Where's the retainer? Here's the retainer. Now I'm just going to run a bit of the helical grease around the inside edge of that, where it bears on that outer helical. Doesn't need much. This only fits on in one position, and it's held in with 6 countersunk head screws. Take note to make sure that the inner helical is sticking out proud of the outer helical. If you have it back down inside the other way around, you may do up these 6 screws and discover that the focus doesn't want to move because you have the inner helical back down hard against the mount. So the inner helical should be sitting proud of the outer helical. These 6 screws are the same as the 4 screws that will hold the focus scale ring in place. Now it's not uncommon if the focus helical had all been dried out, and sometimes the focus sticks to such an extent that when someone forces it, the focus scale ring will move, or even the screw heads will pop past the focus scale ring, in which case you end up with a little bit of damage to your focus scale ring, and the screw heads aren't that good either. So you need to retain 4 good screws for your focus scale ring. Slightly ugly screws will do this retaining ring no problem at all. Okay, so that's all in place. I'll check again to make sure the focus moves freely. I have my focus scale ring all cleaned and ready to go. I've got my alignment marks that I line here from the focus scale ring to the outer helical. I've also got slight impressions where the heads of the screws previously bit into it. So with those impressions also act as a guide to telling me where that needs to go back. I've got 4 small screws here. I'll just gather them together. So making sure I've got my alignment marks good. I can see that screw mark there. My alignment marks are good top and bottom. So I've got 3 points of reference there. Run that screw down very lightly. Same there. Do not screw these screws down hard and tight. All you'll achieve is that you will distort the outer helical, and then the focus won't move smoothly. They need to be nipped down lightly and no more. Check that the focus moves freely. That's all good. Where's the ring from the front? That's what I'm looking for, this piece. This is the focus stop for the infinity position. This is the hard stop for the focus scale ring. It also has a little fork here which catches the screw on the back of the shutter and so prevents the shutter from rotating in the focus mount. Right, they're in place. Let's get those 2 screws done up snug. Check that my focus moves freely. That's all good. Now the gear that runs on the front of the camera to cock the shutter, that needs to go in place, and that's right here. So I'll apply some synthetic grease to the inside of that tube to the outside where it's to run through the bush. And usually I just give a wipe on that front surface where it runs in where the cover runs on it. That should fit over the shaft. Here it is. Now we want the two small screws that hold the cover in place. They're chrome plated. Chrome plated brass and easily damaged. So we want those. And I need the shield that goes around that, the cover. Let's drop that into place. Now these two small screws, if you've damaged one, or if a person prior to you has damaged one, put the ugly one down here at the bottom. I'm just holding down that shutter release with my thumb to get it out of the way, so I've got access to get that screw in. But if you put the ugly screw down in that point, no one can ever see it. Whereas they can see the one at the top here. Alright, so that's all in place, and the front should open and close smoothly. This is the rear of the shaft, and as I turn that you can see that this is rotating here. Well, this isn't the rear of the shaft actually, that's just an idler. The rear of the shaft is further down, so as I rotate this you'll see that it rotates that shaft at the front, which of course rotates this gear here, which rides against the curved rack in the shutter and so cocks the shutter. That's looking good. I think I can put the door on the front of the camera. Of course I've got the leatherette on the base of the camera already, which is contrary to the normal practice. So that being the case, I've got to put the hinge pin on the door and then wiggle the hinge pin into position on the body. And it does not want to stay where it's put. Let's see if I can block this up. That's a bit better. Right, so just looking at these arms, see if they need any bending in to make them stay a bit firmer. I'm putting some synthetic grease on the pins, top and bottom. That'll help retain the paper washers. They're just heavy cartridge paper. You can use anything you like to do that job really. And we'll stretch that into place. Just get the bottom one in place, stretch the door up and click the top one into place. Now I'm just going to collapse the front of the camera partly so I can wriggle the door into place. I should be able to get that hinge pin into position in the body. Somewhere about there. Yep, there it goes, just jumped into place. And of course we want our hinge pin at the top. Now I'm just checking the movement here. There's quite a bit of slop there. There should have been a washer between the door and the hinge pin there. So I'm going to find an appropriate washer. I would rather use one thicker washer, but I've got two thin ones here which I think will fit in there. Trying to line up my hinge pin hole. That's it. And get the screw in place. Now the reason I've got washers in there to take any slop out of that door is that you don't want the front, this supports the front standard. Why is that not pulling up into place? Oh, hang on, I know exactly why. The focus has moved away from infinity. Okay, so if you've got slop here, then effectively the front standard can rattle up and down, and if it rattles up and down, then you can end up with discrepancies in the point of travel of your shutter release as to which point it will release the shutter. You want it to be consistent, you want it to be the same every time. I've still got a bit of play there and I don't particularly like that. I'm going to see if I can find another washer and add that there as well. And as soon as I've done that, we'll carry on with the next bit. Well, that's good, there's absolutely no play there now, that's all nice and snug. So I'm quite happy with the state of that. Now I'll get on and do this film advance. First thing I need to do is assemble the clutch. And the clutch, of course, provides controlled slippage between the sprocket shaft, the film sprocket and the take-up spool. Because as film builds up on the take-up spool, the effective diameter increases, and as the effective diameter increases, it would want to pull through more film with each stroke. So if you allow some slippage, then that doesn't happen, because if it pulled through more film with each stroke than the sprocket wanted to move, you would end up tearing out the film. And indeed that's what happens if the clutch does not move freely or at all. It's not really a common problem with retinas, but it's certainly a common enough problem with 35mm cameras using a similar mechanism for film advance. Now there's our bush for the top of the film advance shaft. And I'm lubricating the gears, the gear sets on here by forcing some grease into them. I'll just give that a wipe through the centre for good measure. Now as I move the sprocket shaft, you'll see one wheel moves, and as I move the take-up spool, you'll see the other wheel moves. That tells me that that's seated. I can put the three fixing screws in place. And before I do those up tight, I'll just check that again to make sure that everything's moving freely before I do those screws up tight. That looks good. You can do those screws up. That's that part. Well, while I'm here, I'm going to do my rewind, film rewind shaft. So, some synthetic grease. Yeah, that's interesting. That's broken. I don't remember ever seeing that. Now, these two components are keyed together. There's a tab on here that runs into that little egg-shaped cutout there. The tab is missing. It's broken off. I have never ever seen that before. That would mean that you could turn the rewind knob as much as you like, but it wouldn't put the film back in the cassette. Very interesting, an unusual thing to find. Now I've got to see if I can find one of these.